Well, good morning, Star Wars fans. Last night was the premiere of Skeleton Crew, and I'm here to give you my spoiler-free thoughts on the show. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it worth your time? Because probably many of you didn't decide to watch it. Let's get right into it. Now, it's not often that I'm gonna say that the Star Wars shills had it right. I mean, after all, a broken clock is right twice a day. But I think they're more right about this show than wrong. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't like the over-the-top kind of fanboying and girling over these characters. It kind of gets a little weird. But I'm going to say that Skeleton Crew was a lot of fun. You can't go into this show expecting it to be the best written thing or the best produced thing that Star Wars has ever made. That's not what this is. This also isn't going to be your traditional Star Wars where you're looking at this battle between good and evil, the Jedi and the Sith. There's something much darker and weirder and interesting going on in Skeleton Crew. And I'm not going to get into the spoilers here. We're going to do that and theorize on a separate video. I just wanted to get a video out to you explaining why I enjoyed it and why maybe you should take some time to see it, because probably most of you haven't watched it and aren't planning to. And I think you should. Now let me start where every good show begins, with the characters. When we're introduced to the characters in the show, for the most part, other than the adults, I think the characters are fantastic. The acting, I think, is on point. It feels really good. And yeah, there's a few moments maybe where there's a few lines of cheesy dialogue. I'm not really interested in hearing the term wizard again. It just doesn't quite work for me, but that's okay. The rest of the way that the kids act with one another and are experiencing this world and seeing it with wonder and awe and this sense of adventure, I think it's really good. I think it's done really well. The acting is really good. Now, I'm not going to sit here and be a part of the Neil crew or all the other KB squad, or I don't know. I don't know what all the names are going to be. Quite frankly, that's super cringe. But I think what's happening here in this show with these actors and actresses is good, is solid. I'm interested to know the backstory of each of these characters. And what's crazy is in the first episode, we get more background storytelling about the main characters than we get in a lot of other Disney Star Wars shows. And even having said that, I don't think the pacing was too slow. I think there were a few moments that felt a little off or that didn't quite make sense if you're really putting this thing under a microscope. But I don't think you have to put it under a microscope because it's not taking itself that seriously. After all, it's not trying to tell a story about the Sith before the time of the prequels. That's a little bit more serious than what we're talking about here in this show. But there's just so many interesting layers with these characters and some of the other characters we meet. But that's also what brings me to the next thing that I thought was really good. We have not gotten many aliens in Disney Star Wars. And I think the way that the aliens and some of the deep cuts that were brought, pulling in from random fan service things, which I think is okay when you pull things like that into Star Wars, it communicates to the OG fans, hey, we're trying to make this Star Wars. And I think there's moments and there's people that are going to say that this didn't feel like Star Wars. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But still with the characters, I think the aliens and the port that they get to eventually and all of the things that you see, even in the opening first scene, the differentiation of it's not just human beings, it's all of this collection of droids and humans and all of it. It really helps. I think they realized that if we're going to have this story about kids, we have to make sure we're expanding in other ways and we're telling this story in other ways. I think it works really well. That's the characters. More could be said about that. I also want to talk about the visuals. I think the visuals in this show are on point. I think the wide angle shots are really good for world building. They don't look cheap. They don't look chintzy. How do I put this? It's not just that there's cinematic shots, though there are. There's definitely a lot more cinematic mind and directing brought to this show than previous shows. And it shows, and it's clear, and it's evident. I think everything feels lived in. It feels real. Even the shots that are far and wide, and you're seeing the world and all of those types of things, it feels real. They're really in a forest. They're really walking through the ground. The dirt is really there, right? Like these things that get interacted with, these sets that get interacted with really add to a lot of it, especially as you progress through that first show. And we'll talk about the feeling of Star Wars and the pacing at the end, but really progressing through that first episode, you see a lot of this, and it really helps with the acting with these children actors when you're engaging with practical sets, actual things like puppets and other things. And there's even stop motion used in this episode. Things like that are Star Wars, are what made Star Wars to a degree. Does this feel like Star Wars? Yes and no. I think there's moments where I'm seeing it, I'm feeling it, particularly we get a mock lightsaber duel between the kids, between Neil and Wim. And I know that this isn't a major spoiler, but I'm just trying to give you an example of why I think some of this is the feeling of Star Wars. And while you might not say like, oh, that is Star Wars, it feels like people cosplaying Star Wars, but at the same time, it's what we did, right? We turned everything into a lightsaber. We turned everything into something that could be used and fun, and we make the noises. And even they talked about on the lead up to this that the noises aren't exactly correct when they make them, because they don't know. And that gets into a whole nother theory video about this world that they grew up on. But that's a different story, but it also is intriguing. But I think things like that are woven in. Wim's desire to be like the Jedi is kind of the baseline for all of this, and it really helps put things in perspective. You hear some of the sounds, and you see some of the things that connect you to Star Wars. I will say, I think the music is more piratey than Star Wars, but I'm not mad at it. It sounded good. Not everything has to be a John Williams orchestral piece. Look at Andor. I think Andor did music in a different way as well, but it still felt that way. Overall, I would give this show a 7 out of 10. Is it the most Star Wars thing ever? No, but I wasn't going in with that expectation. I was just trying to go in and have a good time and enjoy it. But there is one thing that kind of bugs me, and you're going to notice it from the very beginning. And while this show is kind of labeled as a show for kids, it's a show that my kids aren't going to be able to watch. Now, both my kids are under the age of 10, and this show starts off a little bit darker, a little bit more violent than I would have chosen for a kid's show. And I get that. I understand what they're trying to do. They're trying to set up real stakes, real danger, real adventure, and I'm here for it. And that's why I don't really think this is a kid's show. I think this is a show for people like me who miss the things of the past, who want that type of adventurous journey and ride again. Now, I'm going to say, I still think stuff like this works better as a movie than it does as a TV show, but we'll wait and see, because I think the cliffhangers that they've left us on are pretty good. There's plenty of stuff to think about that really makes for an interesting lead up as the rest of the show goes on, and I'm excited for it. The only other qualm, so that was one. It's not really something I was hoping that could be watched with my kids. The second is runtimes. Talked about this in so many other shows. Here's the positive and the negative. The second episode was short, but I understand why, because it was so packed with stuff that it didn't really want to keep going. And so I'm glad they didn't bloat the runtime just to bloat the runtime. I like that. I'm okay with that. But I really don't think if we got an episode each week that was 25-minute runtime, people would be satisfied. I don't think they would. That's not the standard of some of these great shows. 40, 45 minutes is kind of some of that standard for these top tier shows. And maybe that's not trying to be that, but I'm just saying, As long as they tell a great story, the runtimes won't really be a big deal for me. But once the story either starts really slowing down or the pacing really gets off or all those things start happening, then the runtimes start to be a much more glaring problem. But those are some of my thoughts, the positive, a few of the negative. I'll give a much more in-depth, deeper spoiler review and theory about everything. If you want to see that and you want to be here on the channel for that, make sure you subscribe down below. I thank you for being here. Let me know in the comments, what did you think? Give me your rating out of 10. Where would you put this? Or have you even watched it yet? Have I changed your opinion to maybe go watch later today? Thanks for being here. Remember, the Force will be with you always.